We're ready to start. So again, good morning, welcome. Last week we introduced some of the topics that we're going to be covering in this mimer, and I know that for some people it sounded like it was a little bit overwhelming, all these spiritual details, all these concepts that we have to deal with. So I hope it's not too overwhelming, but please God, as we go along, so you will find more and more meaning in what it is that we're talking about. I did tell you last week that we're going to speak about two personalities, and the entire discussion centers on the story of these two personalities and their interaction with them, very well-known personalities, and we're going to read about it in some of the parashas coming up not too far off in the future. So let's have a look at the mimer. We can start it now together and understand what appears at face value to be a showdown between two estranged brothers actually is a template for the entire system, the spiritual system upon which all of Judaism operates. So that's quite a big statement, of course, to make. Let's have a look at how it all works. So the Torah tells us, Vayigash Elov Yehuda Goimer. The Torah tells us that Yehuda approached, and then we're not quoting the full pasuk over here. So who did Yehuda approach? Okay, so the backstory is this. Some years earlier, the brothers had sold Joseph into slavery. Yosef had disappeared off their radar, and nobody knew what had happened to him. And at the time, they were very upset at his attitude and the proposal that he made that one day he'd be a ruler that they would all have to bow down to. It was very offensive to them. And so as a result of that, they felt that he deserved to be eliminated from the picture. One of the ways that they could eliminate him was to kill him. They decided against that. And eventually, instead, they decided to sell him into slavery. But they actually had no idea what would happen next, because on the open slave market, he could have literally landed up anywhere. So they have a sense that he went down to Egypt, and they have a sense that that's where he ended up. Now, because he went down to Egypt was no guarantee that he would have stayed in Egypt. The Egyptians could have sold him on further. When there was a famine and an opportunity for them to go to Egypt because Yaakov wanted his sons to go find food, they used that also as an opportunity to go and see if they could track down their brother Yosef. Meanwhile, Yosef was waiting for them, and they had absolutely no idea who he was, because at this time he had built himself up in Egyptian society, and he was now the second to the king, technically the most powerful man in the country. And most importantly to our story, he was the one who controlled the purse strings. He was the one who decided who was going to get food and who was not going to get food. So whether they wanted to or not, they had to confront their brother Yosef, not knowing that he is Yosef, because that was the person who would be able to give them what they needed to take home in order to feed their families. And as soon as Yosef identifies that these are his brothers, he puts them through a series of tests just to see, have they grown? Have they learned the importance of standing up for their family members? And it gives them an incredibly difficult time from start to finish. But where we are in the story, he's already told them he's not going to give them food unless they bring the youngest brother back with them. That's their brother Binyamin. And when they eventually do, he creates a whole elaborate scheme to have Binyamin arrested under the serious charge of having stolen the viceroy's special silvered goblet. Now, that was a serious business. That was the kind of thing that landed somebody behind bars without much opportunity for reprieve. Yehuda was the brother who had taken personal responsibility that if anything would happen to Binyamin, he would stand up and defend his brother. That's why it is that Yehuda is the one who now goes head to head with Yosef, and that's this pasuk. Vayigash Elov Yehuda. Yehuda approaches his brother. He doesn't know it's his brother, Yosef. It's actually quite interesting, because if you look in today's portion, we're about to read the parasha of Vayera just according to the annual cycle. And if you take the parasha, you split it up into the 7 days of the week. Today's portion also has this word Vayigash. And Rashi explains that the word Vayigash could mean to try and appease somebody, but it could also mean to go to war against somebody. And in Yehuda's case, he was going from both angles. If he could speak in a way that would change Yosef's mind, great. And if that would fail, he would do whatever it would require in order to save his brother Binyamin, even if it meant coming to fisticuffs. So Vayigash Elov Yehuda Goimer. Yehuda approaches Yosef. Ve'isa b'Zohar. So the Zohar gives us a perspective on this story, the impending clash between these two brothers, between Yehuda and Yosef, and it explains as follows. It tells us something which you would never have imagined has any bearing on the story. Says the Zohar, the Hagoshas Yehuda leYosef, that approach that Yehuda made to his brother Yosef, hu inyan smichas geula litfila. That encounter is represented in our daily davening. Okay, did you ever think about this? Did you ever think that in your life you ever live anything that represents the dramatic encounter between Yehuda and Yosef? Unlikely. And yet the Zohar tells us every single day in our davening, we relive that experience of this big clash, this big face-off. When? Smichas geula litfila. At the time where a person is supposed to put geula right next to tefillah. What does that mean? So in the morning and similarly in the evening, just before we get to the Amidah, we speak about how Hashem took us out of Egypt. And we speak about the fact, Goal Yisrael, that God is the Redeemer of Israel. Right? And Goal, He took us out of slavery and out of exile in the past. So when you come to daven the Amidah, it says you have to be soimeich geula litfila, which means that you have to say that brocha, Goal Yisrael, without any break, without any hesitation before you start the Amidah. So practically that means you'll already stand up, so you're preparing to say the Amidah. Some people will already take the 3 steps back before saying the bracha, Goal Yisrael. So you can go straight from Goal Yisrael into the Amidah without any hesitation at all. In fact, in some communities, it's not Chabad custom, but in some communities, the Chazan doesn't even end that bracha aloud because they don't want people to say Amen, because they don't want to have that interruption. So we're told that you have to be soimech geula litfila. You've got to say the bracha of geula, the bracha that represents redemption, right next to tefillah, where you stand up in front of God and you start to petition Hashem for all the things that you need. So now the Zohar is telling us something fascinating, that if you can picture Yosef is sitting on his throne, so Yehuda is obviously approaching him. He's coming closer to him. Says the Zohar, Yehuda coming closer to Yosef is the same idea as taking Geula, the theme of redemption, in that bracha, Goal Yisrael, and bringing it close to the Amidah. Now we have to understand, what does that mean? What's the correlation? Can you see an open and obvious relationship between Yehuda and Yosef and these two parts of the davening? I don't think most people could. So what's the connection? So in order to understand this, in various places in Chassidus, we identify what Geula represents and what Tefillah represents in the spiritual order. Once you understand what each of them represents in the spiritual order, it will be easier to associate that spiritual order with these two personalities. To put it a little differently, we know that the way in which Hashem designed His world is that He created a world using 10 sephiros, which means that the 10 energies that Hashem pumps into the world on an ongoing basis, and that's how every single thing exists, because of these 10 energies. So every part of our spiritual interaction with Hashem will in some way connect with or represent one of those 10 energies. Now that's in itself a fascinating study, don't you think? Wouldn't it be interesting to know which part of my spiritual service aligns with which particular part of the divine energy? It would be interesting. So in this conversation, what we're going to do is we're going to identify Geula as a theme and Tefillah as a theme. So Geula, redemption, Tefillah, prayer, and we're going to say that these relate to 2 of those spiritual energies, 2 of those sephiros. We're also then going to look at Yosef as a person and Yehuda as a person, and understand that most of those early biblical characters are not just people, but they're archetypes for these 10 energies too. The most obvious, Avraham is the archetype of the energy of Chesed. We all know that because he's tolerant, he's benevolent, he's generous, he sets up a free hotel in the middle of the desert. So we understand that Avraham Avinu is the man who represents kindness. But not too many people go further than that. So by the time we arrive at Yosef and Yehuda, we're going to analyze which of the 2 sephiros do they represent. And we'll see that there's going to be a connection. We're going to see that there's an alignment between Yosef and Yehuda and Geula and Tefillah, and we'll see how it all lines up. The common theme is going to translate back to which of the 10 sephiros, which of the 10 energies does each of them relate to? So what does it say? The geula hi bechinas yisoid. In the spiritual hierarchy, the 10 sephiros, the second last of the 10 sephiros is called Yesod. Last week we spoke about how Yesod is a bridge. Yesod is what allows a person the potential to be able to cross over from their internal personal processes, to be able to touch somebody else, to be able to impact somebody else, to be able to inspire somebody else, to be able to share with somebody else, to be able to talk to somebody else. If you haven't created that internal bridge, if in your own mind you haven't yet crossed over into communication mode, then you're not going to be able to communicate. Or to put it a little differently, and maybe even more aptly, if you don't feel a connection with your audience, you're not going to be able to speak to them. So even if you want to convey something to another individual, it doesn't have to be a crowd, an individual. If you don't feel a connection to them, it's going to be really difficult to be able to communicate with them whatever it is that you're feeling. Not only that, or what you're thinking, not only that, if you really connect with that person, it's going to gush from you. So if there's somebody in your life who you feel very close to, then whatever information you share with them will be done with greater passion, with more detail, with more investment, because it's somebody you're close to. So you enjoy it, so you want to share with them. That is called Yesod. So now we're seeing that Geula, the principle of redemption, the ability to break someone out of a prison that they're in, that links to the energy called Yesod. So if Hashem wants to take the Jews out of Egypt, what's the prerequisite for Hashem taking the Jews out of Egypt? He has to care about the Jews, right? If the Jews are nothing, so to speak, then why would Hashem put in the effort to take them out of Egypt? The fact that Hashem takes the Jews out of Egypt is a result of his interest in us. He's, so to speak, crossed that bridge. There's a yesod, there's a bond, there's a connection with us. And because of that connection, therefore, there is the gift of redemption. In Chassidus, we align the principle of Yesod with a particular verse. Here's the verse. So the pasuk says, where do we have a pasuk in Tanakh that speaks about the idea of redeeming individuals? You'll remember from the story of Ruth. Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi, they were in a very precarious financial situation, and they needed somebody to bail them out. So in the conversation about what is called the goyel, there's the word, the person who's going to redeem them, the person who's going to bail them out, they wanted Boaz, who was somehow related to the family, they wanted him to step in. But in order to do that, they first had to go to an individual who is not named in the story, who was closer to the family and actually had first rights or first responsibility to help them financially. And only if he would wash his hands of his responsibility, then they would go to Boaz. So what does the pasuk say? Im yigolcha toiv yigoel. Right? If you could redeem them, it would be good of you to redeem them. And I think if some of the commentaries point out, actually, the guy's name was Toiv. But what's relevant for us is that there's now an association between Geula, that Geula is seen as Toiv, it's seen as something good, V'Toiv hu bechinas Yesod. And in various sources in the Kabbalistic literature, we will always connect the word Toiv, goodness, with the word Yesod, or the principle of Yesod, which is this energy of connection. And you can see why. Think of it this way. Let's use an example we could all relate to. What's the difference between having an interaction with somebody because you have to, or having an interaction because you want to? Here's an example. Let's say that a person's driving down the highway and they get pulled over by a cop. You have that interaction. Do you want to have that interaction? No, certainly not. Actually, I don't even think they want to have that interaction. That's why they're always so grumpy. Because they don't want to have to interact with you. They don't want to have shout at you. You're a grown adult and they have to tell you, listen, you're over the speed limit, or you were talking on your phone, or whatever the case is. So nobody wants this interaction. Now, believe it or not, traffic cops are humans too. That means that when they're off duty, they're actually people who like them. I know it's difficult to imagine, but there actually are people who like them. So when those people go, let's say for argument's sake, the traffic cop who pulled you over and gave you a really difficult time where you thought that you were actually within your rights, and he dug his heels in and said, no, you broke the law, and decided to give you a ticket. So now you hate this person's guts. That same guy goes home, and guess what? There is a kid who runs to the door and says, "Daddy," and wraps their pudgy hands around him. So now what do you have? Yesoid. There is a connection over there. There's a real connection, meaningful connection between these two people. So when you have a meaningful connection, toiv, suddenly that same relationship becomes good. So for the purposes of our conversation, we used toiv as a link between the word geula and the principle of Yesoid. But what we need to know for our conversation is that the element and the energy of Yesoid is an energy of geula. It's an energy of redemption. So in our story, we've got two things. We've got geula, the prayer acknowledging Hashem's ability and history of redeeming us. And we have the principle called tefillah, which is our prayers of requests for personal things that we need from God. So geula is Yesoid. This much information we know. What is tefillah? Tefillah hi bechinas malchus. Tefillah will associate with the last of the 10 sephiros, which is the sephira called malchus. Typically, malchus is translated as royalty, and we know that when you daven the Amidah, and by the way, the Amidah is generically called tefillah, so even though you and I will use the word tefillah to refer to the whole prayer experience, in real rabbinic literature, tefillah is specifically used to refer to the Amidah. So when you stand up to daven the Amidah, the way you're supposed to stand is with your feet together, and the Gemara tells us that you're supposed to stand like a servant before his master. In other words, it's like you're standing in front of the king. And in various places in Jewish law, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, etc., we're warned that you dare not look left or right, don't make eye contact with other people, don't even gesticulate with your hand, because if you were standing in front of the king and you winked at your friend, it would be a capital offense. How much more so when you're standing in front of God? So you can see the connection between tefillah and the attribute of malchus. This is where we acknowledge Hashem as king. But during the course of this mimer, as we unpack both the theme of Yesoid and the theme of malchus in more detail, we'll come to appreciate that the idea of tefillah being associated with malchus is more profound than just simply acknowledging Hashem as king, as we shall see. What do we have so far? We have geula is representative of the energy called Yesoid, and tefillah, prayer, is representative of the energy called malchus. So if we're talking about the fact that you have to put geula and tefillah together, then basically what we're saying is that there is a need in spiritual terms to create a connection between the Yesoid energy and the malchus energy. Maybe they are not naturally aligned, even though they need each other in order to fulfill their real purpose, but they're not naturally magnetized, so we've got to manually put them together. And that's the idea of putting geula by tefillah. Okay, we do not nearly have a full picture yet, and in order to get a better picture, we're going to start to associate these two energies of, now we know which energies we're talking about. We're looking for Yesoid and we're looking for Malchus. So Yesoid and Malchus will now also have to link to the characters of Yosef and Yehuda. So let's see. This should be relatively easy on the one hand. We can now start to see the link between the principle of the energy of Yesoid, which represents the theme of Geula, and the energy of Malchus, which represents the theme of Tefillah, of prayer. We can now start to link that to the two personalities of Yosef and Yehuda. First of all, what was the key word that we used in order to link Yesoid and Geula? We borrowed the word toiv. We said good is a word that is brought in various Kabbalistic sources as a word to represent Yesoid, and we've given a motivation why that makes sense. We will immediately see that the Torah draws our attention to the theme of Toiv with regards to Yosef. Where do we see that? So in the previous parasha, 2 parashas ago actually, in Parashas Vayeshev, so we're looking at Parashas Vayigash. That's the verse that we have quoted. 2 parashas prior, in Parashas Vayeshev, the Torah tells us this: Ki Yosef ben Sheva Esrei Shona. When we are introduced to Yosef, we're introduced to the fact that he's 17 years old. Prior to that, all we're told is that he was born. And that once he was born, it shifted Yaakov's thinking and he was ready to leave his father-in-law's home. But the first thing we're told about Yosef as a person is that Yosef is 17 years old. 17 is a significant number in Judaism because It's Begematria Toiv, because 17 has the numerical value of this word Toiv, which we said is Hu Yesoid, is representative of this attribute called Yesoid, this attribute, this bridging attribute between one reality and another. Now, the truth is that there's a fair amount of literature in Judaism that associates Yosef with the energy of Yesoid. Here's one. Every person will always have their spiritual opportunities and their spiritual challenges resonate with their natural spiritual makeup. If that sounds abstract, let's do it in a way that's a lot less abstract, okay? So let's say this. If you have a person who is super intelligent, two things. Number one, a person who is super intelligent, obviously a big part of how they have to serve Hashem is they have to use their intelligence, because that was the gift that they were given. This is their primary resource, so they have to use it to serve Hashem. But there's another thing they have to consider, which is if they have the super intelligence, then in all likelihood, the greatest spiritual challenge that this individual will have will be about intelligence. They might get too smart. They might try and understand things in their own terms rather than in the terms that Hashem wants us to understand them. So in our history, we have examples of certain individuals who were brilliant minds, and that was their downfall. Or if a person is wired with a spiritual component of chesed, like Avram was. So Avram has incredible chesed. That means the main way in which he has to serve God is using the attributes of chesed. He has to serve Hashem through love. He has to serve Hashem through generosity to others and inviting guests into his home and being tolerant even of the people of Sodom and Amorah, as we'll read in this week's parasha. So what's the Achilles heel of Avraham? Chesed. Maybe he's too tolerant of his son Yishmael. Maybe, as in last week's parasha, he davens too hard for Yishmael to have success, and as the Zohar says, we still suffer from that until today. So, in every area of life, whatever person's strength will be, that will also be their greatest challenge. So in Yosef's case, Yosef we associate with the energy of Yesoid. Now, every one of these 10 energies, Hashem designed us in the Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. That means that there are different parts of the anatomy that are designed to represent these different spiritual energies. And Yesoid is represented by the reproductive organs, which was Yosef's Achilles heel. That's why he came that close to being seduced by Potiphar's wife, because his energy is Yesoid. And Yesoid is the energy of bonding and connection, which is associated with procreation. That's why he was susceptible to a flirtatious woman. Okay, so there's one of the examples that Yosef is the energy of Yesoid. Here's another one. What did we say? Yesoid is the bridge. Yesoid goes from what is internal, my thoughts and my feelings, to what is external. I'm going to share it with other people. Much in the same way as Yosef took what had been locked away in the storehouses of Egypt, and he shared it out to those who came to Egypt looking for food because there was a famine. Similar principle. You're taking what is yours and you're sharing it with others. So Yosef is classically referred to as representing the energy of Yesoid. Ve'Yehuda hu Malchus. And Yehuda represents the energy of Malchus. That's actually a no-brainer, because Yehuda is the scion of kings. Yehuda's legacy is that all of his children would be the genuine kings of the Jewish people. King David would track back to Yehuda. Mashiach has to come from the tribe of Yehuda. So that's a no-brainer. We can see directly the connection between Yehuda and Malchus and Yosef and Yesoid. So now let's make a nice, neat chart of where it all goes. Yesoid, Geula, redemption, Yosef. Malchus, Tefillah, prayer, Yehuda. It's two neat columns, and you can see how they all match up, which is exactly why we have a big question. Because if they all match up, then how does the Zohar tell us that Yehuda going towards Yosef is the same as me in davening bringing Geula towards Tefillah? Do you see the question? It almost looks like opposites. Now we're going to read it inside. And as we do, it should become clearer what exactly the question is. So in various places throughout the Hasidic teachings, the question emerges again and again. When the Torah describes to us that Yehuda had to approach Yosef, that implies that Yosef haya b'mekoymoi v'Yehuda nigash leYosef. That implies that Yosef was static. Yosef was in his comfort zone. He was on his throne, in his palace, in his country. So Yosef is in a stable space and he's anchored where he belongs. Ve'Yehuda nigash leYosef. And Yehuda is the visitor, the stranger, the person who's out of his depth, who now has to enter Yosef's space and approach Yosef. Whereas when it says that at the time of davening, we have to make sure the bracha of Geula is close to the Amidah, well, that implies then that implies that the davening, the Amidah, is where it belongs, it's anchored, and Geula has to be brought towards davening. So that implies that they're two opposite processes. In the Yosef Yehuda process, Yesoid, represented by Yosef, is firmly established, and Malchus, represented by Yehuda, has to move towards it. In the structure of our davening, Tefillah, which represents Malchus, is stable, and Geula, which represents Yesoid, has to move towards it. It sounds like two opposite processes. Not only that, it's not just a matter of direction. In the one case, Geula is moving to Tefillah, or Yesoid is moving to Malchus. And in the other case, Malchus is moving to Yesoid, Yehuda to Yosef. It's not just directional. It's more than that. There's more. Let's ask the question simply. If Yehuda has to approach Yosef, who holds the power? Must be that Yosef holds the power. Why do you go to the office of Yosef to ask for what you need? Because he has it. Why do you go to the office of Yosef to ask him to release your brother? Because he can. So why do you approach Yosef? Because he's got the power, implying that Yesoid has the power. Now when it comes to davening and we say, you need to shift Go'al Yisrael and get it as close to the Amidah as possible. Where's the power then? The power is in the Amidah. Make sure you link Geula plug it into the Amidah. That sounds like Malchus has the power. Make sure to get Yesoid to Malchus. Now, that just raises a huge issue for us. Which is the more powerful reality, Yesoid or Malchus? At this point of our conversation, we don't really even know what the question is, because right now they're two labels. And because of two references, we're arguing that maybe the one label represents greater strength than the other. But as we start to learn more about this, we're going to see what Yesoid actually means and what Malchus actually means. We're going to see that this is a very profound question about where actually is the power. Is the power in the world of Yesoid and everything it represents? Or is the power in the world of Malchus and everything that it represents? And that's going to make a material difference to how we live as Jewish people. So let's round off this paragraph in the text. Besides the original question, which is that it seems the two directions of the story and of how it applies in davening are opposite directions. Besides that, in the story, it sounds clearly like Yosef is the greater, and therefore Yehuda has to go to him. You go to the person with power. Whereas when we talk about how you're supposed to daven and we say Geula has to be close to Tefillah, that sounds like Tefillah is the main thing. So we need to understand what's going on over here, and this is just a launch pad for us to get into a very deep and meaningful conversation about these two energies, what they represent, and how they play out in our lives. Now, before we can do that, we're going to go back in time. This quotation is in Parashas Vayigash, the moment where Yosef is already on his pedestal and Yehuda has to approach him. But if we go back in time, let's go back to the dream that Yosef relayed to his brothers, which got them all upset in the first place. What was the nature of the dream? What did he see in the dream? And how does that talk to the story of his leadership. Unakudas, we're in the second paragraph now. Unakudas habir bozeh behadrushim. So the short version of the explanation as brought in various Hasidic discourses, and specifically specifically as the Alter Rebbe describes it in Torah Or, which is his discourses on the parasha of the week, quoting the pasuk where Yosef tells his brothers about his dream, and he says, what was the dream I had? We were all in a field and we were collecting sheaves of wheat. Now, is that something that sounds like the story of a king? Remember, Yosef got his brothers upset because he kept indicating that he's going to be the leader and they're all going to be subjected to him. Why would a leader be represented by sheaves of wheat in a field? I mean, obviously you don't choose your dreams. But if Hashem wanted him to have this kind of a dream, why couldn't he have had a dream? I was sitting on a big throne and you all came and you bowed to me. That would be quite direct. Why stalks of wheat that become bundles? Now, nothing in Torah is incidental, and even the dreams that are described in Torah are highly specific because they convey exactly the message of what the dream is trying to tell us. That means every detail here is important. The field is relevant. The stalks of wheat are relevant. The fact that the stalks of wheat are then made into sheaves of wheat is relevant. And then, after they are made into sheaves of wheat, that's when they bow to Yosef's sheaf of wheat. That is important. So every detail here is relevant. Says the Alter Rebbe in Torah Or, that what it's teaching us is, I'm going to read it first and then explain it. That the sparks, the brothers, the so-called tribes of Israel, refined, they had to be further refined by Yosef. Okay, let's understand what that means. Generally in Torah, you'll find that there are three kinds of locations that we tend to speak about. We tend to speak about cities, fields, and deserts. They emerge frequently as themes in Torah. So to be out in the desert would imply that you're the furthest you could possibly be from human settlement. So the two extremes would be a desert versus a city. A city is designed for human settlement, and a desert is, as the pasuk says, Asher lo yeshev adam sham. It's somewhere where a human doesn't belong. It's harsh and it's a dangerous environment for us. So to be in the desert, I'm not talking specifically about the Jewish 40 years in the desert, because that's got a whole story to it. But conceptually, to be in the desert implies to be in a very bad spiritual place. To be in the city is to be in a very healthy spiritual place. And somewhere in between is to be in the field. Because on the one hand, you don't want to live in the field. Who lives in the field? Vayehi Esav ish yodea tzayid ish sodeh. Esav was known as a hunter and a man of the fields. That's already context for us. That means that whenever the Torah is talking about a field, that's not the Jewish environment. The field is out there. It's in Esav's environment. It's a non-holy environment, as opposed to Yaakov, Ishtam Yoshev Oihalim, whereas Yaakov was a man of sincerity and of purity, and he stayed in the tents. The tents, of course, in those days represented the cities. So a holy environment is called a city. A toxic environment is called a desert, and an unholy environment is called a field. But why is it called a field? Because you can plant and grow things. That means that it has potential. So there are three environments the Torah speaks of. An environment that is already holy is called a city. An environment that's not going to become holy is called a desert. An environment which is not typically holy but can become holy, that is called a field. Okay, interesting question. Yitzchak, it says, was also in the field. It doesn't say that he was in the field. It says very specifically, Vayetze Yitzchak, so that's the first thing. He went out of his personal environment. He went out, Lasuach Basodeh, to daven in the field. Bearing in mind, of course, that Yitzchak was going to become the father of the Esav Ish Sodeh. that Esav is going to be the man of the field. So Yitzchak wants to mitigate that. And Yitzchak wants to say, let's daven in the field so that we could get the value out of the Sadeh. Okay? So that's quite important. But he's never called Ish Sadeh. That's not his definition. He has to go out of his space in order to be in the field. So those are the three environments. The city represents the environment that is already holy. The desert has no hope. You just have to survive it. And the Sadeh is where most of our work has to be as Jewish people. Now, what do you do with a field? It's not a magical place where because you walk into the field, suddenly there's food. You have to work with the field. You have to plow, you have to plant, you have to irrigate, you have to weed, you have to protect it from pests. So that is called melacha. That's the work that a Jewish person is supposed to do. Sheishes yomim ta'avoid ve'osisa kol melachtecha. For 6 days, that is where a Jew is meant to be. In the field, working the field, so it doesn't remain its natural wild self, but actually becomes a productive space. That is what we call avodas habirurim. Birurim means you refine things. There's a very important Kabbalistic principle which teaches that when Hashem designed the world, He designed two parallel spiritual universes, one called Toihu and one called Tikkun. The spiritual universe of Tikkun is what we're familiar with. It's where everything has a healthy structure and it's hierarchical. So we live in the basement, but then there are many other spiritual floors all the way up to the realm of Atzilus, which is a very, very great spiritual space. And they can all interact with each other and they can all benefit each other in some way or another. The parallel universe is called Toihu. Toihu is just high level, high intensity divine energy with very little structure. And as a result of that, there are these sparks of Toihu that fly down into our world, and we have to find them and return them to a place of holiness. In other words, get them out of the field into the city. That's called avodas habirurim. So basically, every single time you sit down to eat a meal, if that food is kosher, then you're in the field. If you work with the food and you don't just eat it for pleasure's sake, but you eat it as a means of getting energy to be able to serve Hashem and to be able to do more mitzvahs, you now take out of that food the spark of holiness that it has and you bring it to the city. That's like going into the field, harvesting stalks of wheat, gathering them all together into a bundle. Why do you get them into bundles? So that you could take them back to the city. So in Yosef's dream, he's not just simply describing a relationship between him and his brothers, where he is the head honcho and they're all going to be his two ICs. Instead, what he's saying is, I'm telling you what your job in this world is. You, as the fathers, well, as the heads of the tribes, out of your children will come the 12 tribes of Israel, whose entire purpose for thousands of years of history is going to be what? It's going to be to get into the field, pick those stalks, bundle them up, and bring them home. So you are all going to be responsible to engage the world, find its holy meaning, and elevate and reveal it. Says Yosef, what you're going to do is amazing and it's incredibly powerful. However, you are incapable of getting those sparks to the highest potential they could reach on your own. For that, you need me. So you've got to bring your stalks once they become sheaves. You've got to bring them to me. Once you've released those sparks of holiness out of the prison that they were in that physical environment, says Joseph, you're going to have to bring them to me. You're going to have to submit your way of life to my teachings so that I can elevate them even further. So your stalks have to bow to my stalks, meaning to say you have to be guided by my teachings of how to truly elevate yourselves all the way into the city. Now, of course, the brothers didn't appreciate that because the brothers wanted to say, we could do this on our own. Why do we need you? And the brothers were wrong about that because Yosef was at a spiritual level that they wouldn't be able to achieve. And because he was on such a high spiritual level, he was therefore able to translate all of their efforts to success. But they weren't ready to hear that yet, and it was going to come over time. That also, by the way, is why you find many writings that refer to Yosef as Tzaddik Yesod Olam. Now, on the face of it, it means that tzaddik, who is the foundation of the whole world's existence, and we have a principle which says that in every single generation, there has to be at least one individual tzaddik who is that person that the whole world rests on. Thanks to their merit, the world continues to exist. But in context of what we're learning, we understand it even better. The tzaddik, who because he represents Yesod, now we know what that is, right? Yesod is the dimension of godliness. That is the bridge between the internal and the external workings. So he is Yesod Olam. Yosef is the bridge the other way. He's not the bridge from God into the world. He is the bridge from the world back to God. That's what it sounds like at this point. Now, as we learn this mimer further, we'll see it's not as simple as all of that. But for the purposes of our conversation right now, he takes the sheaves of the brothers and he lifts them a level higher than the brothers could lift them themselves. Once we understand how Yosef is able to do that, what Yosef adds to the story that the brothers were unable to achieve on their own, that's when we'll understand why Yosef is associated with the element of Yesod. That's when we'll start to ask ourselves the question again, so where does the power lie? Does the power lie in the work of the brothers, which represents the work of the ordinary Jew, battling through life, trying to make sense of it all, trying to elevate? Or does the power lie with the super tzaddik who just comes along and snaps his fingers and takes us all over the finish line? That's the core of our question in this mimer. What's more valuable? Ordinary people or power tzaddikim? And that's a question that we can only unpack as we go further into the conversation about what are the two energies all about, which, please God, will continue next week.